In the past 37 years, we've experienced many different stories within the Legend of Zelda series, all of which include both unique and recurring elements, whether it be locations, characters, or the overall narrative. Something that makes Tears of the Kingdom unique is that it's a true sequel, taking place in Hyrule years after the events of the first game. Almost every NPC that existed in Breath of the Wild can be found here, and one of my favorite parts of this game was revisiting these locations to see what changed. Keyword, almost. In the entirety of Tears of the Kingdom, 3 NPCs are left unaccounted for, some of which may surprise you given how relevant they were to the first game's plot. Our first one is the character whose absence you likely already know about, the traveling bard himself, Kass. In Breath of the Wild, he can be found all throughout Hyrule, whether it's at one of the many stables or areas connected to specific ancient Song quests. Almost all of these quests unlock a Sheikah Shrine, the only exception being the hero's cache side quest at Kitano Bay. Kass was very quick to establish himself as one of the most iconic characters in the Zelda series, and for several reasons. Kass also returns in the second DLC expansion for Breath of the Wild, recounting the memories of the fallen champions in the fittingly named Champion's Ballad. Of all characters, he's one of the ones you'd most expect to return in the sequel, which makes his absence all the more strange. In fact, one of the only times Kass is ever referenced is when talking to Pen at Wash's Bluff. Originally, this location held Kass's journal where he kept a record of all the different ancient Song locations. In Tears of the Kingdom, Pen states that a famous bard once perfected his craft in this place, studying the songs of this land. Another reason why it's so unusual is the fact that Kass has a family, all of which appear in Tears of the Kingdom. And aside from this one remark from Genly about the Stormwind Arc song, there doesn't seem to be anything that references Kass. Of all people, you'd expect them to be the ones who'd at the very least give us some closure as to what happened to him. It's true that many of the characters in this world don't remember Link, but if we're to believe that Link completing all 120 shrines is canon to the story, he'd definitely have crossed paths with the hero, especially since that was his whole quote-unquote character arc in Breath of the Wild. So obviously this means that he's dead. He's not dead, guys. I kind of understand why people would draw to that conclusion, since literally every other character from Breath of the Wild is present in the sequel, with the exception of like 2 others we'll later get into, but a lack of presence does not immediately equate to death. In fact, back when we only had trailers to work off of, a lot of people assumed that characters such as Teba weren't alive simply because they weren't shown off in the footage. One common misconception is that the former Rito Elder is dead in the sequel when he can actually be found at the flight range. The fact that Kass isn't mentioned at all by his family suggests that he's simply elsewhere, whether it be another part of Hyrule or some other land. And this conclusion makes sense given his entire story arc. Recall that his mission was to seek out the ancient songs and pass them onto the hero, that hero being us. Once all the quests are finished, an additional entry appears in his diary stating that he has finally fulfilled his promise to his late teacher, and he returns to Rito Village. This is the point where Link can find him and learn more about his teacher along with Zelda's true feelings. Since Kass no longer feels obligated to stay in Hyrule, he's free to travel the world. Kass has likely embarked on his own journey, hence his lack of presence in Tears of the Kingdom. But why? If he was such an iconic part of Breath of the Wild, wouldn't they want him to return for the game's sequel? I think it has a lot to do with the Zelda team's mindset when making the game, and this sort of segues into what I feel is the biggest reason that this game's story suffers. Breath of the Wild was a huge success and managed to draw in a whole new generation of Zelda fans, and obviously Nintendo would want to capitalize on this success of the first game when advertising Tears of the Kingdom, hence why they emphasized it being a sequel to Breath of the Wild. But at the same time, Nintendo wanted people to see Tears of the Kingdom as its own separate game, which is a fair concern to have when you're reusing the same open world. Kass being a fan-favorite character ends up being a double-edged sword, in that yes, it's iconic, but it's so iconic that anyone who sees them will immediately correlate it to Breath of the Wild and not the quote-unquote new game. It's similar to the issue that I and many others have regarding the Sheikah technology. It's straight up wiped from existence with no in-game explanation whatsoever, which is strange given how relevant it was to the story of the first game. The same can be said for Guardians, and I'd argue that these were even more iconic than Kass. Including these in the sequel would have definitely made players think they're playing Breath of the Wild DLC and not a whole new game. Things start to become a lot more clear when we take a look at another character, that being Pen. The Zelda team must have really liked Kass's character to the point where they wanted to include it in the sequel, but were worried about it feeling too similar to Breath of the Wild. So they found a solution: introduce a brand new character to fill that role. The first similarity between both Pen and Kass is obviously that they're Rito, but let's look at Pen's story. He's a reporter/writer working for the Lucky Clover Gazette newspaper who assists Link in a series of subquests involving Princess Zelda sightings, all of which take place at numerous locations. If this whole thing sounds familiar, that's because it should. It's this game's equivalent of that Ancient Sans questline with Kass. And to be honest, I did enjoy these more than the Shrine quests since there was more variety to them, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't at least a bit disappointed when I found out that Kass was nowhere to be found in this game. I understand the need to replace his role with someone else, but it wouldn't have hurt to include him at least as an Easter egg or something. Pen was a suitable substitute for Kass, but nothing can replace that joy you feel whenever you hear his accordion music when exploring Breath of the Wild's open world, though I am interested in hearing your opinions down in the comments. Part of Breath of the Wild's Vanabur's questline takes the player to the Gerudo Desert, where you're tasked with finding a way inside Gerudo Town. Eventually, this leads you to the rooftop of the Karakara Bazaar's general store where you receive an outfit, which you then use to disguise yourself as a woman and sneak into the town. The person who sells you this outfit goes by the name of Vilia, who, for some unexplained reason, is absent in Tears of the Kingdom. As for why they're absent, it remains a mystery. The only purpose of this character is to provide the player with a means of entering Gerudo Town, thus progressing the game's plotline. Well, that along with being an excuse to include this hilarious cross-dressing cutscene with Link. Combine that with the fact that in Tears of the Kingdom, Link is now allowed to enter and exit the town as he pleases, perhaps the Zelda team felt that there was no need to bring back this NPC. It's still kind of strange though, since Vilia seems to be the odd one out here. Literally every other character was brought back except for them being the already mentioned Kass and one other individual whose exclusion actually makes sense, unlike the first two. One frequent topic regarding Vilia is his or her gender. Since men are forbidden from entering Gerudo Town, the simplest answer is that this is a man posing as a woman solely so that they have access to the town. And one of the NPCs just outside the settlement states that a man has been frequently traveling between Karakara Bazaar and the town. Relaying this information to another NPC leads to the following exchange, where he insists that the only one he's seen is a pretty Hylian gal. This discrepancy might be because Vilia wasn't wearing his or her veil at that time. While Vilia shares the traits of a Gerudo, things like dark skin and red hair, quotes such as the previous one state that Vilia is a Hylian. Same goes with the Japanese translations provided by Sidier. Even if we were to believe that this was a false assumption made by other NPCs, according to the lore, only one male Gerudo is born every 100 years. I suppose you could argue that Vilia is that person, but it's also said that this male is destined to become the Gerudo's king. With that said, since this information is derived from creating a champion, we can't rule out the fact that it may be incorrect. The only bits of this book that can be considered canon are developer quotes, but this rule has been a staple in the series, thus it's safe to assume that the same holds true in Breath of the Wild. It could also be the case where both things are simultaneously true. For example, following Ganondorf's betrayal, perhaps there continued to be a Gerudo male born every 100 years, with the condition that that person would not become their king. Creating a champion includes some concept art of Vilia without the veil, giving us a clear look at his or her face. It's assumed that this bit is a beard, possibly Vilia's natural hair color since they're a Hylian. The darker skin might also be due to exposure to the sunlight, as most Hylians are born with palish skin. Some have even speculated as to whether this individual is transgender or not, as Vilia does get visibly upset when accused of being male, but it could also be because he just doesn't want his cover to be blown. Regardless, it makes you wonder if this character was removed because some felt it would lead to controversy. Something similar happened with the release of the Thousand-Year Door. In the Japanese version, Vivian is a transgender woman who throughout the game is misgendered and mocked by Beldam. This detail was changed in the localization so that the insults were instead of Vivian's appearance, but it also unfortunately stripped away her trans identity. Full disclaimer that this is merely speculation on my part, neither does it reflect my personal beliefs regarding video game character diversity. Me saying that the inclusion of these elements and/or characters could lead to controversy does not mean I think said things should be controversial. The fact remains that Vilia is one of the only characters excluded from Tears of the Kingdom, and that their removal seems strange given the circumstances. But there's several reasons as to why I don't think this is the case. The first is, obviously, that it's never confirmed whether Vilia is trans or not. The second is there haven't been any recent examples of this sort of censorship happening, at least as far as I know. Lastly, if Nintendo was trying to enforce some sort of quote-unquote censorship on character diversity, the first NPC that you'd expect to be taken out is Bolson. Bolson's always been a very interesting character, from the flashy way he dresses, his manner of speech, or that iconic Bolson dance. It's not that he's gay,
Shocking!
but he's totally gay. Just like I'm totally gay for Prince Sidon. But unlike Vilia, Bolson's actually in Tears of the Kingdom. You can find him over at Lurelin Village and even help him with rebuilding the town. All this to say, I honestly have no clue as to why Vilia is absent in the sequel. Like I said at the start, one of my favorite parts of the game was going to check up on the memorable characters like Moza, Loon, or Flowerblight Ganon. Too bad there wasn't another segment of the game where we had to dress up to infiltrate some well-guarded location. Well, I guess there was that one Yiga Hideout questline. If only Vilia was the one to give us this outfit. Wait a minute.
The Giga Clan all wear uniforms to hide their identities. What if Vilia was in fact in this game all along? What if
she's a member of the Yiga Clan? It all makes sense now. Koshia is one whose absence is easiest to explain. This character was introduced in Breath of the Wild's second expansion pass, where he tests Link in a series of trials, including one final dungeon where the player has to then fight Koshia himself. It's essentially a post-game boss, and arguably one of the best battles in the series. Overcoming this final challenge unlocks the Master Cycle 0. And while Koshia is absent in Tears of the Kingdom, it's not hard to understand why. Whenever Link completes a Sheikah Shrine and obtains a Spirit Orb, the monk associated with that shrine will disappear. This doesn't happen to Koshia, as you can go back to request a rematch, but it doesn't change the fact that the Sheikah technology, such as the Shrines, Guardians, and even Shrine of Resurrection, are wiped from existence. Similar to the Sheikah monks, Koshia has already filled his purpose and no longer needs to stick around. Another reason why they'd exclude him is because he wasn't even in the base game to begin with. Now that I think about it, since Nintendo confirmed that Tears of the Kingdom won't be getting any sort of DLC, it means we won't ever get to see that sort of post-game fight in the sequel, which is a real bummer if you ask me.